Hello, and welcome to today's video panel, Creating a Data-Driven Enterprise, Real-Life Cases. My name is Steve Paul, contributing editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Our thanks go out to EY for their sponsorship of this video panel. This event will be recorded and available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the live event. We welcome your questions for our speakers today, and to submit questions, please enter them at any time in our chat box in the lower left-hand corner of our screen. We'll answer as many questions as time permits at the end of our discussion. If you're having any audio difficulties while listening via computer, please call in via telephone instead, or check the help link in the upper right-hand corner of your console. And now on to our presentation, Creating a Data-Driven Enterprise, Real-Life Cases. Discussing today's topic will be David Kieron, Executive Editor of MIT Sloan Management Review, and Sam Rathsbottom, Associate Professor of Information Systems at Boston College and a guest editor at MIT SMR. Also joining us today is Christopher Meze, Chief Analytics Officer and Emerging Technology Leader at EY. And now let's begin with David.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're really pleased that you're here, and we're also very pleased to discuss with you some of the results of this case study series that's been going on for a year and a half. I'm going to describe in the next few minutes the case study series, why we did it, and then give a brief overview of the case studies in the series, and then describe a little bit of the format that we're going to have today. So let's just go right into the case study series. I'm really excited to share with you the results of this effort, which really started over 18 months ago as we listened to a lot of the talk about the big hype surrounding data and analytics. There's so much discussion about whether or not data and analytics held so much promise that there was going to be a management revolution, and we wanted to explore whether or not this was actually happening, and if it was happening, in what kinds of organizations, how it was playing out. And so we looked for organizations in different industry sectors, in different geographies. We talked to a lot of organizations, and we were only choosing those organizations that were using analytics across the enterprise and trying to do something big, not just in marketing or operations, but trying to do it systematically across the organization. Because if there was going to be a revolution, it was going to be across the entire organization. We also made it clear to potential candidates for the case study series that we wanted to understand the challenges, and we needed to have some transparency into the challenges, the warts, the nasty, the underbelly of sort of what it actually takes to succeed with analytics. And we didn't just want puff pieces. And the organizations that ultimately did decide to participate and that we also selected, all were able to share in some detail some of the struggles as well as the successes that they've had with data and analytics. And those are, the organizations are Intermountain Healthcare, GE, Amsterdam, the City of Amsterdam Smart City Initiative, and Ned Bank, which is the the 4th largest South African bank. So we talked to all these organizations, and the Intermountain Healthcare case was the first case study that we did. And this is a Utah-based healthcare nonprofit organization. It's big. They have 22 hospitals. They manage 185 clinics. They employ 800 physicians, and they have revenues over $5 billion. And one of the very cool things about this case study was that they have been a pioneer in healthcare analytics since at least the 1960s. And they were one of the first ones to build an electronic health record system. And they offered instructive lessons in how they were using data across the organization, in their clinical programs, in surgery, in developing decision support tools, and in their supply chain. We have some great procurement stories in this case study, which is here. Uh, we also very strong examples of effective leadership around the use of analytics. And this is an organization that's made some progress toward the holy grail in healthcare these days, which is to improve patient outcomes and reduce costs. And they're using data in a lot of innovative ways to address those two goals. The next case study that we published is on GE. And they're making a big bet on data and analytics. Perhaps you've seen some of their commercials around their efforts to become a more digital company. They're already one of the biggest software companies, but they're looking to take what they're doing in the industrial internet and take it across their various business divisions, each of which is the size of an entire Fortune 500 company. And we were able to go into their offices and talk to like more than a dozen executives. And we got a really nuanced picture of how they're changing, how this digital focus of theirs is changing not only what they're selling, but it's changing who they're selling to, who they're selling with. Their sales team has had to change as a result of this. And the case is focused on the oil and gas sector. And one of the things I should mention is we were looking for organizations that were across different geographies and across different industry sectors. And so we had a healthcare case. This is in the industrial space, in the oil and gas, in the energy sector. And there's a lot of interesting changes, behavioral changes they've undergone so far, even though they're very early on in their venture in toward becoming a more data-driven organization. And they're also changing. I'll say one more thing about GE. They're also changing like their relationship with their customers in terms of what they're selling, because it used to be they would sell a machine and there would be a service contract, but now there's outcome pricing that they're doing, and they've had to engage a whole different group of people in these kinds of sales. So that's GE, Intermountain Healthcare. The other case study, the next case study that we did was the City of Amsterdam, and that was a really, really cool story about partnerships and how the City of Amsterdam has had to partner in all kinds of ways with all kinds of organizations to advance their efforts to become a smarter city. And they've created a smart city platform in which they've got more than 80 different kinds of partnerships. That's how many were there when we first visited Amsterdam earlier this year. And they wound up, that number has grown to over 100. So they're using data in really innovative ways to influence transportation, livability. Climate is a very important issue for them, clean energy, and traffic congestion, waste management. There's all kinds of interesting efforts underway there, and they've hired for the first time a chief technology officer, really interesting guy, Herr Baron, who he walks around in t-shirts, and he started for them. He's a very gregarious guy, but one of the first things he did was do a data inventory where they looked at 32 different city departments and came up with and identified 12,000 data sets, and began the process of linking these together and trying to see what they could do innovatively with data. And there's a great story about data partnerships there and how to improve outcomes for citizens. The next case study that we did was Ned Bank, and I'm really pleased that we were able to do this case study with Ned Bank, because I've been wanting to do this case study for more than 5 years. I originally did a case study on Ned Bank with the woman who eventually led the business division that the case study focuses on, the retail and business banking division, when I was at Harvard Business School a long time ago. And she told me sometime after she left that part of the organization. She's now a board director of the parent company, Old Mutual, and she was saying that data and analytics, which has been a traditional, very important driver of the business, there's been a step change in how they're using data. And this case study explores several different projects that they're doing with data and how these projects are tied to various strategic initiatives they have. So those are the 4 case studies that are in the case study series. They're illustrative of many aspects of the management revolution, and they also show, in certain respects, some of the key challenges, the key success factors, and some of the trends that we're seeing among many companies in terms of the use of data and analytics. So those are the 3 chunks of discussion that we're going to have. We're going to move into a discussion between Sam, who's been there, sitting there patiently, and Chris, who's like very patiently sitting there, and talk about sort of what has emerged from these case studies. What have we learned about what works, what needs to work in order to have a successful analytics initiative and become a data-driven organization, and what are some of the key challenges. And then we're going to move from that to a discussion of how does this fit into some of the industry trends that we're seeing around the use of analytics, and then we're going to move to a Q&A section. So now let's give other people a chance to talk. And Sam, let's start with you. So what did you see as you've reviewed and commented on these case studies? What strikes you as some of the key factors driving analytics success across the organization?
Yeah, thanks, David. You did a great job of mentioning how different each one of these cases are. They're different industries, different geography. They're just different, and if we're not careful, you might be tempted to think that they're all different and that, oh, it's idiosyncratic. And so one of the challenges that I think that we had in looking at the cases was to think through what are the common parts that we see? What are some things that are pervasive throughout these cases? And that was fun for us to think about. One of the things that I think struck us all was how good these companies are getting at the fundamentals. And Chris has written some, he may mention this, he's written some about how people are becoming analytical visionaries and how much the core, getting analytics at the core is important. And we see that in all these cases. So if you think about something like Intermountain Health, governance and getting the data right and clean is a huge part of their story. That's not exciting. David mentioned hair and his colorful expressions. I think he's quoted as saying it's a boring job. It's hard. They're trying to get a lot of stuff right, and every one of those things is filled with entropy and a desire to decay and fall apart. And they get these fundamentals right. Nedbank is another example. They're reducing siloed information. They had some very incentive-based structures that were aligned with organizational units that didn't really that may have made it difficult to share information across the organization. They've had to step back and change some of those fundamentals. And the GE structure, I mean, how do you deal with that much data? It doesn't just happen by accident. They have a phenomenal infrastructure that they've had to get into place to even build on top of that. So fundamentals is kind of one of the things that's pervasive throughout these. The second thing that I think is fun is how open people are. You might think that, oh, they make all these investments, they build all these things, and they're going to batten down the hatches and keep it to themselves. But that's not all what we see. GE, their Predict platform, it'll use competitor data. It'll actually encourage competitor data. Amsterdam started a open data initiative where they're making their data available. And David mentioned warts and all. That hasn't been 100% successful with every single iteration of that open data, but they've been open about it. GE is, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here, Intermountain Healthcare. If you look at the number of collaborations that are happening across departments and different areas there's a lot going on that wouldn't work by mandate, by saying, hey, you must do this. There's hey, we're on the same team, we're trying to improve health, let's get this going, and that takes some openness. So, Nedbank, they're making this market edge data available to people. They're providing it to their customers, they're consolidating things. These are very different than the way that you think about the skunkworks type of approach that used to happen in the last century. So they're good on fundamentals, they're open, and finally they're proactive. And this also will tee up to some of the things that I think Chris will say is it takes a lot of leadership to do this. They're very proactive. GE, they're doing well. There's no need for them to take this sort of huge step, but they want to be ahead, I think. Intermountain Healthcare, they're building their initiative off of a failed initiative that they've already tried. So they're ahead, even having had a troubled initiative to start with. So they're moving far ahead. Nedbank, they had market edge data available to people before people wanted it, before the customers wanted it. Amsterdam, they got numerous pilots out in place. And so there's a pervasive sort of proactive approach that's throughout these cases. I think many of these things are things that probably we see in these cases, but are probably prevalent in, for example, things that Chris would see across organizations that they're working with all the time.
Yeah, Sam, thanks. And maybe just to underline a couple, key points. There's obviously many in there, but I think the point about sort of stakeholder management across the business becomes so important. And it was something that we saw in each of these cases. I think the one that maybe resonated with me the most was Intermountain Health and how they recognized from such an early point in their overall journey the importance of involving doctors, involving nurses, having medical practitioners be a part of the process. And it really kind of rippled through everything they did, from encouraging physicians and the medical practitioners to really question the data, to feel comfortable with the underlying information, to share best practices across different parts of the hospital chain. And it was also a driver in how they thought about organizing their analytics resources. They very consciously made a decision to place analytic teams very close to sort of the frontline practitioners. And there's always that kind of question of how much do you sort of centralize versus how much do you keep close to the business. And at least in their case, organizationally, it was very important to have the analytics teams working side by side with the medical teams. And I personally think that was a big part of what's enabled them to be successful. So that stakeholder management piece is a common theme that we sort of see through the cases and something that we see every day in all of the work we do. The other point, maybe just to pause on here, is the linkage to the overall business strategy and thinking about data as an asset that can really enable that. And I think Nedbank, is a great example of that, where obviously they issue debit cards, credit cards, have point of sale card data, all types of information that they started to think about how could that be more valuable to the merchants and how could that strengthen the customer relationship that they have. And so they looked at data that they have, such as demographic information on who the cardholder is, all the transactional level information, the retailer location of the transactions, and ultimately put that into this market edge platform that allows them to provide insight to the merchants that they might not otherwise have. And they didn't just do that as a sort of net incremental revenue opportunity. They did it as a customer intimacy value proposition, which was kind of central to the overall business strategy. So the sort of linkage between what they were trying to drive in the business and how they thought about data as an asset to enable that is something that we see across all of the cases. And I think the Nedbank example is just a really rich story about how they brought that to life. So that's a couple other points I would emphasize.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sam. So let's let's move into the next section of talking about sort of some of the challenges that you saw in the stories. I'll start this off. I mean, one of the things that one of the stories that really struck me in the Intermountain Healthcare case was how the data didn't really explain. So they were having some infection rate issues they wanted to address in surgery, and the guy who was the head of surgery wound up using a lot of data and identifying from 30 different factors, five different factors, and they started managing these five factors in the surgery room in an effort to lower infection rates. And one of these was not wearing personal apparel in the surgery room, like a hat. And one of the surgeons was a fan of wearing Boston Red Sox hats, and this was a big deal. It's a big deal for surgeons not to wear their personal preference clothes in the surgery room. And but the head of surgery was able to convince the doctors that, hey, there are five factors. We're not sure which one it is, and there was some resistance from the docs. But just as Sam had said, they had a shared purpose around sort of improving patient outcomes, and they wound up going along with the head of surgery, and who said, look, after 6 months, if it doesn't work, you guys can go back and keep wearing your clothes. And after 6 months, they, in fact, the infection rates had lowered substantially, and the surgeons then wanted to go back and said, well, we don't really know which one it is, but it's probably not the clothes. We'd like to go back to wearing the clothes. But the surgeon, the head of surgery, held firm because they didn't really know. And that's one of the key things that came out for me with the challenges around data, because data doesn't always determine a course of action. It oftentimes underdetermines a course of action, and you need to be able to really blend experience with the data in a way to achieve your goals. So that's let's use that as an example to start off the discussion with some of the challenges you saw with in the stories around the use of data and analytics. Sam?
Yeah, so actually I had this giant prepared list, and I'm going to just kind of toss it here and build off what David said in order. That I think we're attracted to simple answers. What you'd really like is to say that, well, you do X, Y, one BuzzFeedy way to fix your analytics tomorrow. David's point brings out that's really just not the way things really work. If you look through all the cases, there's no simple answers. There's no sort of quick fixes. And actually, I have to say I kind of like that. I mean, if there were quick fixes, everybody would be doing this. And the lack of a quick fix means that there's opportunity for organizations to work on all the different ways of improving data and analytics and get some value from it that differentiates them from other organizations. And so I think a lack of simple answers was both a challenge and a place for people to do something different. Talent has been another one that comes across almost every organization we come to. They would like to have people who are much savvier about data throughout the organization in every sort of line of business. Chris mentioned that Intermountain, they try to put data people right next to functional areas. There's a shortage still of talent, and David and Pamela Prentice and I wrote on this last year about how much reward organizations can get from talent. So that's a pervasive one. The other thing is that organizations struggle going to scale. So almost all the organizations that we talk to, they have some sort of initial pilot project, which is brilliant to do. I mean, you're dumb to go whole hog, and then we talk about GE being a big bet. They're a calculated bet. They're not gambling here. They're taking strategic moves step by step. But many of the organizations have had trouble going to scale. that what works in a pilot is really difficult to get pervasive throughout the organization, and it takes a combination of many things to make that happen. And finally, one of the things that kind of is underlying all these things is privacy. And what does this data do? What does it show? What does it tell about people? Whether it's Amsterdam and what people throw away in their garbage, patient information, obviously, with Intermountain. Privacy is a big deal, and that's important. Something that we've written on at SMR is about now organizations have the ability to do things that they could never do before. The question now is becoming, what should they do? So they can do things, what should they do? So those are some things that struck me as a complexity, talent issues, scaling issues, and privacy. But I'm not sure, Chris, I'm sure, has different things that struck him as hard about the whole scenario.
Yeah, no, those are all really, really important challenges. I think one thing that we see broadly is that, despite significant investment levels, and most companies have invested in this area. In some cases, it's tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. That there still is this real challenge in terms of getting to value, and we believe that one reason why that is that many companies have disproportionately focused and invested in the sort of technical aspects of analytics and underinvested in more the human side or the sort of consumption of analytics. So if you think about two different dimensions of capabilities that you need, there's what we call analytics production, which are all of the things that are required to create an insight. Do I have the right data? Do I have the right technology? Do I have the sort of data science or the advanced analytics skill sets that you need that are tuned towards helping answer that particular problem? And those are all critically important, but they're still only half the equation. Right? The other sort of dimension here is analytics consumption, which is required to ultimately move from having an insight to taking action and really driving value. And that includes things like culture of the organization, the underlying business processes, the skills of the end user, whether it's a marketing professional or a doctor or whoever the person is who has to take the action, and the incentives that those people are under. And all of those things are the friction that we see often getting in the way to moving from having the insight to actually creating value. And I'll just give two specific examples. These are outside of the four cases, but I think kind of bring this to life. One is a telecom company that we had worked with whose analytics team had built a customer retention model. And the model was actually quite good. It could predict reasonably well sort of what customers were most likely to leave. But the model was tuned towards making that prediction only 2 weeks out from a customer leaving. And sales and marketing needed a bigger window, really more like 4 to 6 weeks to ultimately take the necessary action to stop a customer or to hopefully stop a customer from leaving. And it may seem obvious after the fact, but the analytics team actually didn't ask that question, right? What was the sort of process that the insight would have to be fed into, and what was the timing window that they had to be able to deliver the insight? So there was this fundamental disconnect right out of the gate. Another example was an industrial manufacturer whose analytics team was trying to predict which customers were most likely to pay their bills late. And so they built a model to do that, and again, the model was quite good. The intervention mechanism that the finance team decided to put in place to address that was to have a customer sales rep reach out to their client, either send a letter, make a phone call, and it wasn't just about the bill, it was, how's the service or how's the product, and by the way, on October 30th, you have a bill due. But guess what? The customer sales rep was not incented to do that. They were rewarded based on revenue and customer satisfaction, not reducing days receivable. And so there was this disconnect between the incentive sort of structure that the end users were under and how they were trying to get value from having this analytics insight. And those are just two small examples, but we see those all the time, this sort of lack of focus on what's the consumption of the analytics really going to be. And when you look across these four cases, they worked really hard at that, and they didn't always get it right the first time, but there was this constant focus on that aspect of things, in addition to putting in place all of the analytics production capabilities that they needed. So I think that's a really important thing, and I wanted to highlight that from a challenge perspective because we see it with many, many clients who we work with.
I love those examples. Those are great. I wish I knew them.
Yeah. So let's move the discussion to the last part, which is on sort of what do we think about sort of the management revolution, the idea that that data and analytics really could provide a new way of managing. What do these stories tell us about that? And I mean, is there a management revolution happening? And do these case studies, reinforce your belief about that or undermine it? Sam,
This is classic sampling bias to ask us if we think that there's a revolution happening with analytics. I think you can guess what position that we'll likely take. But what's the reasons to support our thinking that way? I think that might be the more interesting. One of the things I think about is uncertainty. I mean, that's a classic business problem, is dealing with uncertainty. And analytics is far from perfect in predicting the future. Chris gave some good examples about, it's great to know if something's going to happen in the next 2 minutes, but it may not be actionable. So it's great about uncertainty, but I think that ignoring data is worse than just kind of guessing still. And this is the traditional tension, I think, that between balancing and how you work with experienced people and how you work with data. This idea of reducing uncertainty and getting a handle on where the uncertainty is a big part of this management revolution. I think there's another thing with influence. Lots of organizations are used to the way their industry works right now. And the prevalence and the importance of data, I think, could really change things. Examples are that we think about data collection from devices. It may be more that the device themselves is less valuable than the data from the device. And when you have that weird flux happen, I think we're going to see some very strange things happen. And what I mean by that, right now we're used to going to the store and paying for an item, like I'll pick a light bulb. We're used to going to the store and paying for a light bulb. But if that light bulb is then throwing off data, then it's not clear to me who should pay who in this scenario. So we may switch to a world where the fundamental directions of payments change. That's going to change the power within industries, between organizations, between suppliers, between customers, between competitors. It's going to mean industries are different than they used to be. So I think that's a big change. And what I also think is fun, too, is this idea that people aren't satisfied. So you can stop with the idea of optimizing processes. And Chris nodded to this a few minutes ago. But most of these organizations are not. They're going beyond that and thinking through what would be the next step. What happened if we, let's optimize, that's great. But what would be the next step? And a good example of this is customer service. I'm seeing a lot of AI things around customer service. Well, hey, we can have interactive voice response systems that help our customers and annoy them completely. So it may be wonderful on optimizing your P&L for customer service and reducing the cost associated with customer service, but it may be a crushing blow to your customer service experience. Or it could be wonderful. People may get the answers they need quickly. That's some things we have to figure out, and that's part of, I think, this idea of a revolution.
Yeah, I would just add a few things. I think that there is tremendous pressure on organizations to improve performance. And if you look at long-term and also recent trends in terms of labor productivity, in terms of corporate profits, I mean, it's not a very pretty picture. So the impetus for change is there. I think from an analytics perspective, which I do personally believe is already changing and will continue to change kind of where and how value gets created in most industry sectors. There's the data side, which I think each of us have talked a lot about, and just the explosion of information that's available and how it can be used. But I think the other side, which we haven't talked about yet, is the rapidly decreasing costs of compute, of storage, of all kinds of technology. And it's that decrease that makes the application of analytics commercially possible in so many sectors. And obviously Moore's law everybody's familiar with, but that's actually just the recent manifestation over the past couple of decades of what is a much longer-term trend, and the exponential improvement in the price performance of different types of technology. And I think it's worth pausing on what does exponential mean, because it's sometimes hard for the human mind to fully process that, right? If we're talking about a linear improvement in something, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, I go out 30 times, I'm at 30. If I have an exponential improvement of something, I go 1, 2, 4, I go out 30 times, I'm at 1 billion. A billion times improvement in the price performance. And that's why we all have supercomputers that are sitting in our pockets for a few $100s, which would have been hard to fathom 5 or 10 years ago. And so I would want to make sure everybody, don't underestimate the impact on an industry sector or on a business that underlying improvement in terms of price performance of technology is going to have. And I think GE is a good example where that's what makes it possible for them to do what they're doing from an IoT perspective. So I think that's really important. And I think what we see across organizations is that there are a reasonable percentage now at this point, I'd say it's maybe around 10%, that really are getting it right, that are starting to drive competitive differentiation from the application of analytics. And some of the themes that we're talking about in these case studies are the underlying success factors that we see them really focused on to drive that success. So I just wanted to add that kind of dimension to the conversation because I think it's important. I think you're on mute, David.
Yeah, David, we're not hearing you, or I'm not hearing you. I don't know. Let's transition perhaps while David is getting his mic coming. I think what David was actually headed towards was he was headed towards looking for some questions that others might be submitted. So if you have questions, I think you can do them. There's a little chat thing on the right side there that you can actually submit questions for us, and we can start to answer those. But I'll take advantage of the fact that David is preoccupied here, and I'll get to lead off with a question. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as Chris was talking is, so what does leadership look like in this, and what's the role of? I mean, we've seen people take big bets. We've seen people have to really take some steps of faith, perhaps, just some uncertainty. What's leadership like for that? What are you seeing in your organization about leadership's like?
Yeah, I would answer it two ways. I think at the senior executive level, it's about really committing to the importance of this and backing that up with investment and action throughout the organization. We've seen a lot of new leadership positions created, right? Chief analytics officer roles, chief data officer roles, this notion of putting an executive in place to really help drive this throughout the organization. And we've seen a lot of those people fail, and we've seen some of those people succeed. And I think there's a couple characteristics of that role and what good leadership looks like that I just wanted to offer to everyone. The first is that analytics leader has to be a business expert, right? That they have to understand the business, the industry sector very well, how the organization makes money. It doesn't mean they have to be an insider, that they have to have lived in that business or that industry for a long period of time, but they have to really understand the business in a very deep way. They have to be kind of an innovator in the sense that they have to see where in the business model there really is the most opportunity to drive differentiation, and from that, how they can architect, solutions to address those opportunities and kind of be this bridge between the business team and I'll say the kind of technical team, which could be IT, could be analytics, but ultimately to be able to ultimately architect a solution to whatever issue is they're trying to address. And I think another and really underappreciated part of the role, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, but is to be a network builder within the organization. There's a skill to getting things done in any company, particularly large, complex organizations. And so having a large number of trusted relationships, spending a lot of time on stakeholder management is an underappreciated part of the role. And I would say it's the most common reason why I see chief analytics officers, chief data officers, or other people responsible for analytics fail. So those are some things I would highlight in terms of leadership that we see as being important.
People are important? I thought it was all about the technology. Come on.
Yeah,
okay.
Indeed.
So let's move the discussion to addressing the questions that have been coming in from the audience. We'll have about 20 minutes to answer them. I just wanted to mention one other thing before we get into the questions, and that is I have had the pleasure of working with a great team to produce these case studies, and I hope everybody who's attending this video panel that they get a chance to read and really grapple with the stories that are here. Two of the case writers were Michael Fitzgerald and Laura Winnig. Michael Fitzgerald is actually now an editor at the Boston Globe, and Laura Winnig is a longtime case writer at Harvard Business School, and she's now at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Also, Sam very kindly has donated his time and written commentaries on each of the case studies, and he's also made comments on some of the case studies prior to their publication. Very helpful comments. Appreciate that, Sam. And Nina Krushwitz, who has shepherded these case studies from the raw content to their final published form. So with that, let's move into the question and answers. And the questions have been streaming in, and I'm going to start one question with Sam, and because it's about what skills are missing to be a good data scientist. And why don't we start with that? And Sam, if you want to punt it, feel free to punt it, but it'll come back to you anyway. And then I'm gonna jot down a few other questions as you begin speaking, and then we'll have a robust discussion about several of these.
So I've been watching other people take questions in some recent televised forums, and I'm going to use the pivot technique here a bit to answer the question I want to answer a little bit more. So there's the idea of skills missing, and no question, we could start to tick through some of those. In some of the studies that David and I have done, there are numerous skills that are absent, and what's interesting to us always is that technical skills are rarely at the top of the list. I used to have a software company. Back in the software company days, you had problems that were solvable by caffeine and pizza, and those tend to be technical problems. You can jump on all those. You can stay up all night. You can get a real fun problem going. Those are not the ones that are catastrophes. And so we do see, again, skills are missing. But many of the things that people are missing is the idea of managerial, insight, communication, visualization types of skills. And what I'll caution people is, I think we get into a mode of thinking that we've got to have I keep hearing this as different colors and animals. So it's the purple unicorn. So it's not just a unicorn that's a special beast, but you have to find a purple one. Or the silver squirrel. I'm not sure where people come up with all these different animal color combinations. But what happened is organizations are looking for these do-it-all people, these superhumans that can do all these things. And you know what? There are a few of them, but chances are they're going to cost, and they're going to be hard to find. And so I think what we really have to do is get better at organizations around building processes and procedures. And due to data and analytics, where we don't need this wizard to do all that, I need a color like green wizard to do all these things. We can specialize, we can build roles, we can develop the process. And I think that's the challenge for people. So that's a little bit of a pivot rather than answering specifics.
No, and I want to just add to that, because I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's putting a team in place to address whatever the issue or sort of area is. It is going to be so rare to find that purple unicorn. I love that. I hadn't heard the purple part before, so that's good. And so you get, it's, I mean, the magic happens when you can effectively put the sort of business and the subject matter domain people together with the sort of math or the data science folks who really understand how to solve whatever the problem is analytically, with the technology skill sets that are also required. Because it's sort of one thing to answer the question once, it's another thing to be able to industrialize that kind of at scale across the organization, and that's often a different type of skill set. And so there's just no shortcut to putting teams in place that have those capabilities and having them effectively work together. And I think that's actually threaded through some of the cases in terms of how they did that in different industry sector constructs. But I agree, Sam, entirely with your point.
Yeah, so I'll answer the question.
Rebuttal?
No, I mean, just one thing. I think one of the things that comes through in the case studies is the importance of communication around data, communicating the value of data, being able to communicate across among the different stakeholders, and oftentimes the people who are the best at understanding data and its value aren't the best at communicating its value. And where there's that gap, there can be challenges. So, and that's one of the reasons why some of the masters, sort of the new masters programs in data science, is actually teach storytelling to these folks. So, totally agree. The soft side is very important, and I'm glad there was an opportunity for Sam to get in some color talk. So,
is that what I am? Color commentary?
Color commentary, perfect. So there's another question about measurement. Like, what are the big challenges around measuring value from data and analytics projects? Chris, you want to take that one, or start?
Yeah, sure, happy to. And we see it. That is a very big challenge. In fact, some of the research we've done asks that question specifically, and we tend to find somewhere between 60 to 70% of analytics initiatives really do have trouble measuring the value proposition that's actually been delivered. And I would point to three reasons why that is, or at least why companies typically say that is. One is that there's too many factors that are influencing the business outcome, and so they have a hard time isolating the impact that the sort of analytics and the resulting actions have on whatever the sort of business measure is that they're focused on. A second reason is that people will say that capturing the required data is too difficult or too costly, so we're just not going to do it. And the third reason, and this I think gets to your point, David, is that even if I know the value, it's the effectiveness of the communication to key stakeholders, which takes both some art as well as a trusted relationship. So it's those three things that we see most common, but I can't emphasize enough that those just aren't excuses that people should tolerate, and they simply have to be overcome, because the way to have a sustainable analytics program, the way to ensure that analytics teams are focused on the right things is to have strong processes in place to measuring value. And all those things that I mentioned are things that can be overcome. They're not going to be overcome every single time. It's not going to be perfect, but they're absolutely doable. And being able to really communicate, demonstrate value is hugely important.
Yeah, I think a bunch of measurement issues, of course, but you have to. We have a tendency to think about measurement versus perfection versus measurement versus nothing. And and actually, if I get my hands right, I think it's easy to see where things fall short. But there's a big difference in getting some data around a problem, building a process towards improving that, getting better the next round and the next round. Intermountain showed that. They've got a great governance process in place around that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we've found in some of the research that Sam and I have done in the past couple of years is that having a sustainable analytics program involves communication like among the stakeholders, but also like leadership and actually maintaining that over time. Sort of maintaining the goal of analytics is a really important part of having a successful analytics, not for a particular project. Well, yes, sometimes for a particular project, but for systematic approaches to analytics, you need strong leadership. And finding leaders who have the will. I mean, one of the interesting things about the GE case study is that this was an organization that identified strategically a market opportunity around data analytics, and they've been building that, and so their ROI around that big bet is it's not a short-term ROI. This is a strategic initiative that they're looking to reshape their organization, and certainly like many organizations aren't going to be doing that kind of a shift, that kind of a transformation around data and analytics. But it is absolutely clear that having metrics in place is critical to sustaining an organization over time, and having the leadership to, if there are some if there are some poor returns, to keep it back, to keep the backing going. So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's another question around the hypes. There are a lot of questions, so I just wanted to let everybody know your questions are being read. Some of the ones that are very sector focused, we're not going to get to because we want to have answers to that sort of apply to as many people as possible who are attending. There was one question about sort of bottom-up versus top-down approaches to implementing data initiatives. What are the thoughts on that? Which is in some respects touching on this leadership question, because there are a lot of analytics initiatives that may start sort of within IT. There are analytics initiatives that can start at strategic levels that are then that connect to IT. What do you have a perspective, Sam or Chris, on like what kinds of initiatives require bottom-up approaches? What kinds require top-down? Is this, or is this even a useful question if you think about sort of propelling data and analytics initiatives forward?
So I'm happy to start. I think that it's not an either or. I think it depends on the kind of organizational context. So if we're talking about an organization that is trying to drive significant change, or that is under high degrees of sort of performance pressure, and analytics is a key part of how it sees addressing that. That tends to have to be driven, top down, right? I mean, GE as an example that's a top-down driven change in the organization. And it would have been really hard for them to make the investments they've made, make the progress they've made with that solely being bottoms-up. I think there's lots of situations, though, where bottoms-up can work very effectively. You know, if you're talking about trying to improve the performance of the current business model and improve the performance in a particular function or a particular business unit, that can be driven bottoms up. I think what's really important there is starting with the business problem and letting that kind of drive everything, which sort of sounds obvious when you say it, but we see so many organizations that approach this more from a sort of technology or kind of data perspective first, and you know, we're going to build all this cool technology, we're going to get all the data perfectly together, and then magically value is going to happen. And that's just a recipe for spending a lot of money with uncertain returns. And so this relentless focus when you're talking about a bottoms-up situation of defining the business problem and defining really specifically where and how analytics is going to improve that and how you're going to change business processes and how you're going to change business decisions, that becomes really important. And I think that can work effectively in a number of ways when you're talking about bottoms-up type situations. So I think it can be either. It really depends on what's the organizational context that analytics is trying to be applied. Sam, I don't know, would you add to that or perhaps disagree?
Why do we always want to make it A or B? What's our fascination with dichotomies in this world? We want this to be top-down or bottom-up. We want it to be technical or storytelling. We want it to be production or consumption. Everything is going to... That strikes me, actually. I know Chris has an undergrad in engineering, and I have one as well. I think it was a constrained optimization. If you say you can only optimize on one of those two dimensions, someone who has freedom to optimize on both dimensions will always smoke, because the optimization on one of the dimensions is a subset of optimizing on both. And so I think we got to get out of this dichotomy thinking and towards blended.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Chris.
You knew I didn't you?
Okay, last question. And that has to do with where are we on the hype cycle? This is a question on the minds of some. And it's, I mean, we did start this case study series under the impression that there is this management revolution to come, that it's beginning to happen. How's it playing out? You know, we wanted to understand this, and as Chris mentioned, there is a certain level of dissatisfaction around returns from these investments in analytics, and you gave a very insightful and clear and coherent and robust answer as to why some of these investments haven't been working out. But does that mean we're about to turn a corner once people figure this out, or or people are going to stop investing because they're so dissatisfied? We have our own data and analytics initiative where we're actually finding that some organizations, actually more organizations, are beginning to turn the corner and actually are creating more value with data and analytics this past year than in any of the past 5 years that we've been, or 4 years that we've been asking questions around, are you getting a competitive advantage from analytics and innovating with analytics? And it's exciting. It's a 1 year reversal from this 4 or 5 year trend down. But it does speak to the possibility that companies are beginning to get a handle on their data and analytics and derive value from it. And would you have a quick 30 seconds each to add on to that? And then I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, and we're going to close it out for today.
So my sort of 30-second view from a macro perspective, and I'll use the Gartner terminology in terms of the hype cycle, which is something they use. But I think probably 3 or 4 years ago we were at the kind of peak of inflated expectations. I think, last year or sort of 1 to 2 years ago, we kind of entered that trough of, disillusionment where people start to realize, wow, this is way harder than we thought it was going to be. Maybe there isn't something there. I do agree with you, David, that we're coming out of that. And to use Gartner's terms, we're on the slope of enlightenment. So I think we have turned a corner.
Sam?
There are lots of different hypes going on at any given time, at any given place. There's not an aggregate, one single hype. I think we're looking at lots of different things, and I think that's what makes managing in the midst of all of these so very difficult.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. We're going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to close it out here. Really appreciate everybody's attendance, patience, and thoughts. And thank you very much.
Okay, and thanks, gentlemen, for an excellent discussion today. Over the next few business days, please look out for a feedback survey that will be appearing in your email, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts and opinions. Also want to just let our audience know that you can find the case studies that are discussed in today's panel at mitsmr.com/data-cases. And that should have been sent to you via email. That concludes this portion of our program, and thank you again to our speakers, David Kieron, Executive Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, Sam Ransbotham, Associate Professor of Information Systems at Boston College and our guest editor at MIT SMR, and Christopher Mezzi, Chief Analytics Officer and Emerging Technology Leader at EI. We also, of course, want to thank our sponsor today, EI, and a reminder that the recording of this program will be available within the next 3 to 4 business days. Thank you all for attending today's program, and have a great day.
Thank you.